our webinar. Just to repeat what Mayor Ness has said, we ideally you mute your computer, and also you'll have a better experience if you take your video feed off. Just creates better bandwidth in your own access point. Donna and I are practicing social distancing. We're in our respective offices and joining you electronically. Myself from our boardroom here at the Casa Group, and Donna in her office. The format today, we thought what would be most helpful, there's so much information in the public space right now for you to access, from the political side to the health side to the governance side, that what we know you're most interested in as board of directors is what are the legal constraints we're operating under, and within those constraints, what are some management best practices that would help you in your role as a board member? I know you've heard this many, many times, but we are in such uncertain times. We're literally going through an experience that probably none of us ever have. Donna and I were talking yesterday, because I always kind of look to the legal side to kind of give me some guidance, and there's even legal issues here that haven't been settled. So the poor legal community is doing their best to provide us some guidance. We thought the best format for today would be really a conversation between Donna and I. We have over 100 questions from the several hundred people that are on, and so I don't even think we'll get through all of those, but we try to consolidate them. So we're hoping we get most of your calls answered, and you can send any communication you want, whether it's a technical one or a question, to info@casagroup.com. We probably won't get it today, but our thinking is if our feedback from you after this meeting is positive, we could do one every week just to keep you informed. I will tell you that most of the people on this phone are boards of directors. Castle has a Castle residential multifamily group, so we may have some apartment rental owners. But even though most of us are sitting in effectively the same chair, some of us have condominiums, some of us have HOAs, some have high rises, some very spread out communities. So there are going to be some nuances we'll try to get through. I think that the one disclaimer I want to say is each of you have either Castle or another management company, and each of you have either Donna or another legal firm. We're all kind of in this together. I've spoken to probably 5 other major CEOs of management companies, and we're literally sharing best practice. And I know Donna's having good communication with her legal community on what's best. But nothing today is prescriptive. Nothing today is legal advice.
Thank you, James.
Yeah, Donna some cover here. And there's never been a time, I believe, in the management of communities, it hasn't been more important. Whatever we do, get your association's attorney to bless it. We're going to
James, now is not the time to be shopping for free legal advice in the midst of a pandemic. Yeah. So you're going to see a lot of information out there on this crisis in social media, and that's all, food for thought. But just to your point, make sure you're reaching out and discussing this with your association attorney who knows your community best. Thank you,
Donna. I think if you go to the next slide, I know, Don, I'm going to have to take your beautiful picture off the screen here, but Marinette, go to the next slide, please. One of the things that I wanted to cover is, in terms of just big picture, as a board of directors, what do I need to be concerned about? I mean, number one, obviously, is your health and your residents' health. And the second one is the environment that we're responsible for, that our residents are in. And then if there is a presumptive or a confirmed case, what do we do? And so what we've done, and I know a lot of the management companies have done, we manage over 300 communities. We need to know that all of the best practices that we're recommending that are blessed by legal counsel are happening. So you'll see on the screen right now, and every company would have a different one. We're literally down the left is every association we have, what kind of communications have been sent, has a COVID or coronavirus 19 plan to be put in effect, when was the last time it was updated. We're tracking supply levels at all of our communities. And so it's important that we keep, this is the detail, how we're tracking, how we communicated, have we got best practices, have we made sure the environment that our residents are living in are well taken care of. And what each of you should have, and we've sent out, and by the way, anything I talk about today, if you hit info@castgroup.com, whether it's from Donna or myself, anything we can share, we can share. We have put together something called a playbook, and we call it a playbook and not a guideline because it's such a fluid situation. Every day we're learning more about what a better practice is, and we're happy to share that. Donna, I think what you're finding, and I'll stop for a minute, is your management companies are sending these guidelines and playbooks to you, and you're kind of giving them the legal blessing. What are you finding in terms of the direction that the management companies are giving to the associations from a management perspective?
Yeah, the management company protocols are hitting, James, all the points they need to hit, which is what needs to be done on the ground in these communities. What kind of heightened sanitization protocols need to be put in place in the high traffic areas? How are they going to handle deliveries? Now that we have more and more people who are, homebound, either because they're self-quarantining or because their employers have sent them home to work, you're going to have a lot more in terms of traffic when it comes to delivery personnel. So the management company protocols I'm seeing are actually hitting all the high points from what I can tell. How do we continue to operate? Will there be coverage? Is life going to go on as close to normal as possible? And I'm really finding it's a collaboration between management and legal on some of the tougher issues that we're going to talk about today in terms of, can we restrict guest visitation? Can we shut down non-essential construction projects? And of course, what should be the protocol, not if, but when we are notified that people have either been exposed to this virus or actually have tested positive. And that's one area where I would urge every management company to urge their boards to reach out, because the notification and disclosures, that's something where you're going to need legal input on how to navigate that.
Well, that leads us to the next slide, Marinette, on communications. And what I found interesting in my preparation for this webinar with Donna is we're being asked by our boards, and we're going to answer the question shortly, what should we do? And, because there isn't any absolute answer, Donna, you've really taken quite a strict approach to this. And I found that very helpful because, and I want you to speak to it. Basically, we're going to have questions, should we shut down amenities? And you're going to take, a fairly strict, I think, position on that. But you're going to have communities on here that go, well, I want to keep my pool open. I want to do this. I want to do that. But what I loved about Donna's starting point was that's kind of a baseline. Okay, if you want to be absolute 100% certain that we're doing everything we can, you start here. And then anything off of that is a judgment call. But Donna, talk to us, because the next slide is about how we communicate to our residents and our boards and our teammates. Kind of give us your philosophical perspective on where we should start in our decision-making as a board.
Yeah, it's a great question. And communication is going to be so essential to navigating this crisis. Most of us are just so keyed in right now to the 24-hour news cycle, right? I find myself even doing this. If I go more than 3 hours without knowing what the COVID numbers are nationwide or in Florida, I feel like I'm missing out on something. So we've got a perfect storm here. We've got a 24-hour news cycle that's pumping out information. We've got more people than ever that are homebound. So you're and in our multifamily buildings, James, which I'm sure you're experiencing, you've got people on top of each other. You've got emotions that are amped up. And on top of that, every community that I've worked with for the last 20 years has at least one disgruntled person living in it, often a little core group of disgruntled people. So this is why it's important for the board, as we navigate this crisis, to establish an official communication channel to try to dispel the other information or misinformation that's out there. So a lot of boards, and Castle does a fantastic job with this in terms of creating communication channels. They use Facebook, they use some social media, they may use group email chains, they may use group text, they may have an association website. but you need to let people know, because this crisis is changing on a daily basis, and protocols that we put in place 2 weeks ago will now need to be revisited and modified. You know, as the executive orders come out for the local cities and the counties, you're going to have to go back and revisit your protocol. This isn't like a hurricane plan where you put everything in place and we're pretty well set for the entire 6-month hurricane season. This is almost like a weekly storm season, and that we have to keep going back and revisiting it. So I love the screen we've got up as to, and we can talk a little bit about who we have to be communicating with. But I would urge every board member listening that if you don't provide consistent information to your residents, they're going to be looking elsewhere, and they're going to be looking on the internet, and they're going to be watching their preferred TV channel, and they need you as leaders in the community to be saying, to be calm, but also to be providing a consistent stream of accurate information.
So Donna, you know what I really want to do is be able to kind of highlight some very specific takeaways for our boards on this webinar, and I'm going to start right there. In our talks yesterday, obviously the number one thing is the health of our residents, but there will be and have been confirmed cases in our communities, and there will be everyone will be looking to the board and management as to whether they handled it well. And one of those things is that they communicated to everybody. And so the one point I want to highlight that you said is it's really important that each community establishes which will be their official. Doesn't mean they can't have all kinds of communications. In fact, we encourage it. But are you doing e-blast? Is it email? Is it updating websites? But whatever it is, the take-home value point right now on this book is decide as a board what the official channel is. Speaking of that, just looking at this slide, Donna, we're on a Zoom call right now. Funny story, I sat in this chair a week ago and I said I should buy some stock in Zoom, and it was at 105, and I saw this morning it was 150, but so I think I missed the window. But
maybe Netflix too, James.
Yeah, Netflix and Zoom. So not that we're giving stock advice here, but the communication theme, Don, is going to flow through the rest of the questions that we're about to get to. But one thing I wanted to address from the management perspective is we've been asked by our own clients and by our teammates, is property management an essential service? And the quick answer is yes, it is. I mean, we have to operate these buildings. Can you imagine if we didn't keep the communities clean, if we didn't enforce the rules, if we allowed social gatherings, and particularly important in our adult or 55 plus communities where the risk profile is higher. I mean, the demographics in every community that we're talking to today on this webinar is different. So what the confusion though is that we have a federal government, a state government, 67 county governments, and then hundreds of municipal governments, and very few of them have provided guidance on essential service. So our position is, number one, we reside here in Broward County right now, where they've declared property management, building maintenance, an essential service. We are using that as a kind of a platform for the municipalities that haven't got there. And we've even given our teammates letters that they're carrying with them in case they're ever stopped on their way to a property. And some of you, and you need to check with your manager and with your local municipality, some of them are even requiring permits to get on barrier islands and whatnot. So Donna, any comment? Our position is we're essential service. Our position is we're giving our teammates in the vacuum of any official announcement a document that says that. Any legal guidance, not legal opinion, but any guidance from a legal perspective?
Yeah, well, James, your position that Castle and other management companies are essential services is actually backed up by the latest county orders that I've reviewed. So Miami-Dade County and Broward County, and we're kind of the epicenter down here in South Florida, the Tri-County area, but there's cases throughout the state. But down here, I've reviewed our orders, and those orders do clarify that contractors, repair servicemen, and all other persons who are needed to maintain and protect the property are exempt, are considered essential services. So certainly from a management perspective, your personnel that are out there, your front desk people, your in-house manager, your valets, all of those people right now are considered essential services. That's not to say that a week from now that the orders could not tighten up. We just have to, again, this is why it's so important to stay on top of this, because it continues to evolve. But for right now, absolutely. And I'm sure, knowing your technology, that you're working on virtual services, management services as well, and preparing in case that noose kind of tightens in terms of what is and is not essential.
Yes, in fact, the other question that's going to come up from the board is, what about my on-site teammates or employees? And I will tell you this, that to the extent that you can have them work remotely, that's fantastic. I mean, that's mitigating health risk. I will tell you, I'm sitting here at home office of House Group. Normally we have 120 teammates here, and we would have less than 30 today. And all other 90 are working from home and remotely. So I want to make the distinction. Essential service doesn't mean all teammates need to be on site. That's a property by property decision. In fact, I would encourage any ability to be remote. Obviously, our housekeeping and maintenance staff, we're doing double duty, and we're going to talk a bit about how we get packages in and how we get the properties cleaned on a regular basis. So Don,
but James, if I could jump in for 1 second before we move off that point. I've had just hundreds of conversations with board members in the last 2.5 weeks, and most of it is about how to keep the residents safe. And safe, as you and I discussed yesterday, safety first is the framework here. But people also have to take into account how crucial it is to keep your management professionals safe in these communities. So one of the protocols I'm suggesting in my COVID-19 plan for my client communities is, if the open door association office policy needs to change, okay? The drop-ins need to change. Your manager can be exposed to a lot of different people if you've got an open door policy. Perhaps you require phone calls, emails in advance, appointments to stop into the association office. But steps have to be taken to keep your staff healthy as well.
One of the best practices we've seen in many of our communities is the management office is open. Metaphorically, the door is actually closed. And we're asking for our residents to call in, either email, if we can do it by phone or email, let's do it. But if they do need a face-to-face for whatever reason, we set an appointment, and then we've established a room and a protocols to make sure that both the resident and teammate are safe. So that's a great point. One other thing that's just popped into my mind, not necessarily germane to this slide, is we have a lot of lifestyle directors in our community, and and they're running obviously a lot of the amenities, which are now closed. So what do they do? And the answer is, we're trying to create virtual programming, and this is another take-home value. We literally created newsletters that can be customized to the community, that has an incredible number of things that residents who are in their house and going stir crazy can do together virtually. So there's another way that we can all stay safe, but not be bored out of our mind.
Did you hear about the man who ran a marathon on his balcony?
No.
You haven't heard that story?
No.
For everybody listening, Google it. There was a man who literally ran a marathon. It was hours and hours on his balcony.
Okay, that's extreme. All right, Don, I want to jump into the questions we have. Some of them are in the PowerPoint because we got them early, and some of them I've made a list, if we can get to them, that came in later. So Mariness, let's go to the next slide, or next, I think it's 2 forward. Okay, so for our participants, these are questions you sent in. And I think the way to do this, Donna, is there's the question. You kind of give us the legal framework, and then I'll opine, if appropriate, about what we're actually doing on the ground in terms of best practice. So can we prohibit guests from entering the community?
So my first distinction is what type of guests. So there are people, let's start off, who have a legal right of access to your property. Those include process servers and census takers. Although I haven't heard of any census takers out and about in our communities, I did recently read that a census taker did test positive for COVID-19. The reason we're getting asked these questions is because people want to minimize the risk of exposure. You can't completely eliminate it, particularly because now we are not under an Italy type shutdown. People are still coming and going from these communities. So it's entirely likely when you go out to the grocery store or wherever you're going, residents could acquire the virus out there and bring it back in. Okay, it's not always about the threat coming from the outside. Sometimes the threat of exposure is inside, frankly. But there is still the very reasonable concerns about allowing life to continue as normal in terms of having guests coming and going. Okay, I want to frame this that there are risks in doing anything here. There's risks in doing nothing and allowing life to go on as if we're not in the midst of a global pandemic. And if you're overly restrictive, you're going to get people at a minimum very unhappy. At a maximum, they're going to threaten to sue you for the steps you've taken. Okay. The advice I'm giving my clients is this: non-essential guests, I think it is reasonable in light of the state, federal, and local states of emergency to say we are going to try to only allow essential visitation at this time. And again, all of these protocols can be revisited in the weeks to come. This is not something that needs to be concrete for weeks or months or years. So bear that in mind. The advice would be essential guests are caretakers and immediate family members. I do have some communities that are limiting the amount of family members you can have right now. And they're doing that as part of a board's COVID-19 disaster plan that they are implementing pursuant to the statutory emergency powers under 718, 719, and 720. They're also cutting down on construction. Those would be non-essential, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So basically, most of my boards are trying to eliminate what we term as non-essential guests. For instance, you got people at home. If you're bored because you're homebound, we don't want you inviting 10 people into your unit because you want to have a party, a COVID party, because you're bored.
Yeah. I think, I know I happen to live in a high-rise building myself, and they are, number one, encouraging, and I think this is a good strategy. It's not necessarily a legal one, but a great communication to the residents. We are finding residents being more and more compliant and understanding because they're watching TV and they're seeing if they don't help, it's going to get worse. In our building, they are even taking the temperature of guests when they come in. Now, do you have a comment on whether that's something that is kind of enforceable? Can you not have someone come in if they are high temperature or showing signs of sickness?
You know, I'm not in favor of that temperature taking method, and I'll tell you for two reasons. One, the scientists, and we're all glued to Dr. Fauci every day, have said that you can be shedding the virus without having a temperature. So my fear would be, James, that would be twofold. One, if you're taking the temperatures, does it give a false sense of security that if the guest is not showing a temperature on that particular hour and day, you've let them in, does that give a false sense of security that they're okay? Does that somehow minimize the social distancing? I see that as a real problem. The second issue I have with the temperature taking is the personnel who's doing it. What if they're not doing it correctly? What if they're not doing it consistently? What if they're taking every 3 out of 4 guests' temperatures? I just think that in this crisis, and you said it accurately at the outset, I take a fairly hardline stance on minimizing exposure because I think it's the right thing to do in terms of safety first. But I also don't think boards should be acquiring additional liability during this crisis. Boards have no legal obligation to start taking temperatures. Our volunteer board members are not doctors. They're not pandemic experts. You know, they should be reaching out to doctors and experts in terms of this, but they should not be expected to act as crisis control to manage a pandemic in that way, in the way of taking temperatures and assessing who may or may not be infected.
One of the reasons I want to do this webinar was we have so many board members out there concerned about their roles and responsibilities and how far that responsibility goes. You mentioned something to me yesterday I'd like you to repeat now, and it's not really for the purpose of scaring our board members. It's more the reality that there is a responsibility, a legal responsibility to the board. We're doing it in the context of should pools stay open. But can you articulate what you said to me yesterday in a non-scary way about what could happen to a board if they didn't use reasonable enforcement of rules?
Yeah, James, do I look scary?
Yeah, you do to me, but that's
So here's the thing. We live in a litigious society under ordinary circumstances. Would you agree?
yes.
We've got people filing complaints over parking places. Everything has been elevated in this crisis. There is potential for liability depending on again, if you take no action or if you take overly strict measures to try to control and exposure to the virus. But there is language in 718, it's 718.111(1)D, that says that board members can be held personally liable if they exhibit reckless disregard for the safety of their residents. And I do bring this up to my communities because I think they have to take that into account. There may very well be lawsuits down the road. And if we get back to what was a reckless disregard, you have to ask yourself, was it reckless to allow a pool to stay open in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of local, state, county, and federal states of emergency? Now, that's a decision every board has to make after consulting with legal counsel. But I'm hearing some information, well, it's the chlorinated water will kill the virus. That's magical thinking, in my opinion. And by the way, it's not about the water. It's about the social gatherings. Now, there are ways to do this. Just as there's ways to hold your meetings electronically so you can continue operating and administering the community. In some communities, it depends on the size. I have one community that's 7 homeowners. That community, we can easily manage having the pool open because we don't have that many residents, okay? But in my high rises with hundreds of units, if you take away all but 10 chairs and space them out, how are you going to control that? Which 10 people get the lounge chairs when you have 350 people living in the community? These become the real issue. Again, the medical advice keeps flowing out. We've now been told that the virus can live for up to 7 days on surfaces. Not about swimming in the water, it's about all the surfaces you're touching at the pool, whether it's the lounge chairs, the tables, the handle, the railing on the pool, whatever it may be, the gate to get into the pool. These are the things you have to talk about. And I have to tell you, James, I'm somewhat dismayed that people may grumble, but they can live with the pool being shut down for weeks on end for a renovation project, but they're having a real tough time with the pool being shut down when it may very well save the life of some of the vulnerable residents in their community.
Yeah, and I don't want everyone, that's excellent framing, because I do think it highlights the responsibility of the board. We're not saying you should or shouldn't open or shut a pool. It is circumstantial, but it is a good example of where the responsibility lies for a board. You mentioned renovation a pool. The next slide, Mariness, I think is a discussion that we got a lot of questions about. Can renovations happen? Are we allowing, how are we controlling access to the community or building for third-party contractors or vendors and projects? Donna, what's your thought on that?
Well, it's funny because the courts are kind of framing this, and one of my partners at Becker brought this up in terms of a mission critical framework. And I think that it is analogous to what we're seeing here. You have to ask yourself, is it essential or critical that we have pavers installed right now, or that we do an aesthetic painting project? Again, every one of these projects needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And we're in the perfect storm here in Florida because, James, what do we have just around the corner on June 1st? Start of hurricane season. So if there are certain life safety projects, we have to balance the safety issues here. Certainly, if a client came to me and said, should we proceed with installing the smoke alarms? My answer would be yes. And there's steps we can take in terms of requiring those contractors to wear protective gear. I have this in one of my communities where there's a piping project, and we know there's some very vulnerable residents who were just out of the hospital, and we're taking extraordinary steps to let them know that if they don't want to have the contractors come in, we can work around that. We can delay it for a few weeks. But for all the non-essential work, and I always say this, is it necessary that Mrs. Jones renovate her half bathroom right now? Probably not. If she's got a water leak, that's something different. So I would urge boards to employ both common sense here and speak to legal counsel about which projects should continue and which shouldn't. There's some outside work that can continue, but you may need to change the protocol. Again, this is not business as usual. In the past, you may have had workers outside who enter the building to use the restrooms. They wander through the hallways. They may even socialize with people. These are the type of things you have to take into account when you're trying to minimize exposure. And again, that's what we're saying as we sit here today, James. 3 days from now, we may be under a complete shutdown, stay home order, which is going to again change the landscape.
One of the things that we did fairly early was we said to our residents in our communities, subject to the board's decision, was look at if you have a project that's in place right now in your unit or your home, finish it. But we won't approve any new. I think that was probably appropriate. I think one of the challenges we've had in Florida, maybe America, was it's been so incremental. At first it was over there in China, it didn't affect us. And then it was in Washington State, and now all of a sudden it's right here. And so I think we've appropriately been tightening up the rules. But I think the bottom line on this one from a management perspective is the less people entering the community, the lower the risk. That should be the principle we follow. And I think that's consistent with, your right there.
Yeah, and your protocol that you just articulated, James, is in line with what we've been recommending with the renovation projects. We gave them notice. It's always nice, you don't want to do a cram down approach. Sometimes you have to, but to the extent that you can work with your owners where you can make it less painful, certainly that would be appropriate. So for renovation, we gave in some cases 72 hours saying to get done what you can get done. If there's any safety issues, if you were in the midst of ripping up your flooring and there's some dangerous spots, then we want to make sure that that gets finished. So there's no inherent safety problems inside the units.
The next question is going to be about people traveling from out of town, but I'm watching our time, and I one of the big questions from everyone was, should they or shouldn't they close amenities? And I know we talked specifically about the pool, but there was no, I don't want to run out of time and not address the amenity issue. And I'll start this one, Dawn, and you can kind of put the legal framework on top of it. We basically are taking the starting point of, can we close all the amenities and work backwards to what works for that community? I would think that most of our communities now have their pools closed, but we do still have some open. But I think as a general comment, to the extent that you can close amenities, it obviously stops social gathering and it's less cleaning so that we can have increased frequency cleaning on high touch points. What is your position on amenities staying open or not?
Again, you have to look at whether or not this is, a multifamily building, what the size of the building is, how many residents you have. But here's the thing. Under the statutory emergency powers, boards have the right to, one, implement a disaster plan, which can be as broad or narrow as they want. And number two, they have the right to declare certain portions of the property unavailable for entry. Now, those powers were drafted to respond to a hurricane or other property damage situation in Florida. They weren't truly designed with a pandemic in mind, but we do have information from the Division of Florida Condominiums that they do believe that these powers apply right now while we're struggling with COVID-19. So I think boards need to get with legal counsel and map out what they should do, how inclusive, how broad or narrow their disaster plan should be. I think when it comes to closing the amenities, I've been asked this question. For instance, the Miami-Dade order, some of these county orders specifically exempted gyms that are attached to hotels and private residential communities. So some boards will say, okay, well, if that's okay, that means we could keep our gym open. That's true. You could, but you have to ask yourself, should you? We always have instances where our local restrictions, with the most local restriction being your private covenants in the documents, can be more restrictive than what the county's saying. I just want to analogize this to the person who says, I want to put up this kind of shutter and it meets code. That's great that it meets code. We've got our own restrictions in this community about the type of shutters we want. So we can be more restrictive. Many of my communities are shutting down all amenities because, again, you have to be prepared down the road to speak to a trier of fact, whether it's an arbitrator or a judge, and explain why some amenities needed to be closed and others didn't. And we're not scientists.
Sorry, Donna. You mentioned emergency powers. I'm not sure our boards appreciate what additional power that gives them. And some of the questions we got offline, Donna, were, what are our powers now? And maybe just start at kind of a higher level. The emergency declaration, kind of in general terms, what additional powers does that give a board of directors?
Well, there's a lot of different powers attached, and I will tell you, some of our attorneys at Becker, one of my partners out in Southwest Florida, he routinely, when he does a document upgrade, he will include these emergency powers in the document. So something to think about moving forward is speaking to your attorney about upgrading your documents and amending your documents. Hey, we're all home. Maybe this is the perfect time to be working on updating documents. In terms of the statutory powers, I would urge people to get a legal opinion from your association counsel. Those powers include things such as holding meetings with less notice than you would typically require, passing special assessments with less notice than you would typically require, and what we mentioned previously, which is implementing a disaster plan and or closing off portions of the common areas that would typically be open to the owners once the board makes the decision that in terms of safeguarding the property and the residents, those areas should no longer remain open.
You know what, I'm going to go off script here a bit, because some of these conversations just segue so nicely. You mentioned emergency powers. One of them is how it affects meetings. Let's talk about whether board should be holding meetings, and if so, how, and what changes does this environment create for us as board members in having our meetings, including their annual meeting? Yeah,
great question. This is not the time to go dark. Boards, everyone listening, this is not the time to go dark. I know that board meetings during normal life, not typically the height of your life to go to a board meeting. Many of them are not the most fun you're going to have in the week. But right now, boards have to continue to operate and administer the community, and a big part of that is communication and holding meetings. There is no reason that you can't use technology to hold those meetings. We've got a number of Zoom meetings set up with our clients throughout the state. A lot of times right now, they want their attorneys, given what we're dealing with, they want us to attend those meetings, and we can easily set those up via Zoom. You can also use a speakerphone. You can also urge people just to watch the in-house cable channel of the board meeting. So I think regular board meetings right now are more important than ever. Just employ the technology that's out there to be able to hold it. Some communities that are real old school are doing it outside. Okay, yeah. They're spacing people out far apart on the tennis court or where have you, and they're having it outside. But for most people, they're using technology. In terms of the annual meeting, there is no reason, in my opinion, to be canceling elections. That is not a good look. Some people look at that as if the board just wants to stay in power for another year. You can split the election apart from the annual meeting. And because this is happening at the time of year it's happening, I think, James, at least from our perspective, most of our elections have already taken place. There's a few that are still out there, but I think most of them have taken place.
You mentioned that you can actually have an election without an annual meeting. I just wanted you to repeat that.
Yeah, for condos and co-ops, you don't need an annual meeting to hold your election. You need 20% of your eligible voters to cast a vote. So in an HOA, you will need a quorum to hold your election. That's a quorum of 30% pursuant to the statute, unless the documents require a lower percentage for an HOA quorum. But we've done a couple different things with this. We've urged people like last week, I had a client. We told people, make sure you drop off your ballot or mail it in. Don't expect to show up at a meeting with your ballot. We want them in ahead of time. Then we got a small counting committee. We videotaped the opening of the ballots. We made sure that the people handling the election materials wore protective gloves. Because again, we don't know how long the virus lives. We know it lives for days on different types of surfaces. So some buildings are actually saying to people, choose 1 or 2 representatives to attend the opening of the ballots, as opposed to having people crammed in there. Because again, you need to follow CDC guidelines. Right now, the CDC says no social gatherings in excess of 10 persons.
I will say to the listeners, their Zoom, which we're on right now, we obviously have a paid subscription for larger groups, but we have information we can send you on all the different ways you can do calls electronically. a lot of them are free. I believe Zoom under 100 participants, they have a freemium model. So if anyone is interested in getting more information, we're not advocating any technology, but there are several out there.
James, one other last thing before we move off of that. Look, I know in communities that there are people who are always highly suspicious of the election results. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
You keep all the election materials, you seal it in a box. You're going to keep it for months and for years. So after the crisis passes, whoever wants to go through the election materials, they're welcome to go through it. And we don't know yet how the division is going to handle any complaints about election improprieties in the aftermath of this crisis. We just can't tell you right now.
Okay, so that's meetings. We started talking about access, and there's a lot of different access questions up here, and I think it'll take up the whole rest of the meeting, and I want to move on to a couple more topics. But I think as a general rule, anything you can do to restrict access is a good thing. But the one thing that I know that owners are concerned about is selling or renting their units. So can you speak about the community's ability to restrict realtors and sales and leasing in a community now?
This one is really fraught with potential liability, and this is one where I absolutely urge boards to obtain a written legal opinion from counsel. In terms of realtor open houses, I can tell you most, if not all of my communities, they don't permit open houses like that on an ordinary basis. So they're certainly not permitting it during a pandemic. The reason they don't allow realtor open houses during normal times is for security risks. For now, it's because of safety risks. So the open houses, I don't know any of my clients that are allowing open houses. Some are still allowing appointments for people to come in. And again, this is today where we're not at a stay-at-home complete lockdown. This may be completely different next week. Is it essential for a realtor to have people come into the community to see the property he or she is selling? Arguably, no. You've got all the 360 virtual tours online. So I think it's reasonable, if you're asking me that question, during the next 2 to 3 weeks until we know where this pandemic is headed, to tell your realtors, please take advantage of the virtual tours and do your showings that way. A realtor could even get on the phone with the potential purchaser and walk them through the virtual tour and go into more detail in terms of the property. So I do have a lot of clients that are doing that. In terms of shutting down sales and leases, that I think is just way over the top. You still have to allow business to go on in your community. Whether or not you should allow a move-in, that's a different story. I've had some clients say, well, we're just not going to act on these applications. Well, guess what? Look at your documents, because most of the documents contain language that says that if you don't approve or disapprove within a certain time period, which is typically 30 days, then you've automatically approved the transaction. So boards need to continue to work on these applications, evaluate them on a good faith basis, and speak to legal counsel if they do have questions or concerns about approving a particular application.
Okay, I'm going to just take a quick break, Donna. We're getting several questions on the info@castgroup.com, and I can tell with the timing here, we're going to be very respectful that, first of all, we're going to solicit our feedback from you. We're going to have to do another one, and so if we don't get to your question today, we'll get to it next week. We assure you. We still have 45 minutes here. Two big areas that I don't want to miss are payments. I can tell you at council, we're starting to get owners calling, say, I just lost my job, I can't pay my maintenance. And how should boards respond to owners saying they can't pay their maintenance?
Well, we've been here before, haven't we? We've been here back in 2007 and 2008, and we had this issue. I think this is, again, going to be a customized solution depending on your community. The communities that have fully funded reserves and available lines of credit are going to have different options than those that don't. The ones that have put away for a rainy day, they may have options in terms of getting a membership vote to tap into the reserves to pay some of the operating expenses and reduce the burden on the members for now. Again, a lot of what we're hearing right now is anecdotal. Until the jobs report comes out, we don't really know how many people have lost their jobs. We don't know how many layoffs there have been. So again, we're kind of in uncharted territory, but I'm hearing the same thing you're hearing, James. Can the board waive late fees and interest? Some boards are already considering that. Some boards are considering reducing the assessments, but you'd have to do that across the board. One of the requirements for the board is to collect assessments uniformly in order to fund essential community services. You may also have to look at your services and see if there's anything that's not essential right now. Remember back in 2000 and 2008, 2007 and 2008, we had boards operating on shoestring budgets because they had to. Their delinquencies went up from about 1% to 2%, in some cases upwards of 40 and 50%, particularly if it was a rental a community with a large percentage of investment owners. So now I want to throw a wrinkle into that. There is federal legislation pending out there. As you know, Congress is working, we hope, to help us right now. And some of the things they're throwing around might actually hurt associations in terms of being able to collect assessments. Assessments are considered consumer debts, and there may be a bill coming out that says you can't collect for a while. So that hasn't passed yet. We're keeping our eye on it, but this is going to be a conversation, certainly when you're talking about collection policy and what you should do. You need to talk to your attorney sooner rather than later.
Yeah, my thought is this: the community has to operate. The community can't operate without money. Accessing reserves is a possibility. We're talking to all of our banks about making credit available for short term. I think it's too early in the process to know what the impact's going to be. One thing we have to do is treat everyone the same. And so my recommendation at this point is it's collection as normal. That doesn't mean you're going to pursue the collection action all the way to an end, but the truth is there will be people that won't pay because they can't pay. And I think we have to follow the process, and maybe a month from now we realize the extent of it and have to come up with another plan. An example that you just made up, if we have a super large portion of our community that's not paying, we may have to recast the budget or access reserves or access credit. But I think it's too early to start establishing different policies than the ones they have, Donna. That may change 4 weeks from now, but my non-legal advice to clients is it's business as usual from the collection point of view until we see how bad this is.
James, I couldn't agree more. The last thing you want to do is come up with a knee-jerk policy without knowing the full extent of the problem. And again, we are not in this is one area where we are not completely in uncharted territory. Our community suffered through a multi-year recession where they saw their delinquency rates double, triple, and in some cases quadruple. So I agree with you. And by the way, not everybody's losing their jobs. A lot of people are working from home and they're still gainfully employed. The last thing you want is people who are gainfully employed, but they're not prioritizing their association assessments. I have a feeling in the coming weeks and months, my advice to clients is going to be what it was back in the recession, which is don't sit around and wait for banks to do the right thing. You've got the ability to move forward with your collection efforts and your foreclosures and get people in who will pay. So I have a feeling, but we want to strike the right balance, but we don't know enough right now. You know, we can't rely on the news media to tell us what's really happening in our communities. We have to make those decisions for ourselves.
I know that sounds a bit harsh, and it is, and that obviously there's legitimate hardship out there, and we're seeing more and more of it. That doesn't mean we can't come up with a long-range plan, but we do, as board members, have to protect the interest of the whole. Okay, I know with only 10 minutes left, there's going to be lots of questions, or were lots of questions about, all right, we have a presumptive or a confirmed case in our community, and I'm going to start with just some examples we've experienced, Donna, and then you can maybe put some guidance on this. This is where it comes down to the health of your entire community and your teammates. And by the way, on the teammate side, we call our employees teammates at Castle. I'm so impressed by our community leaders. They've done everything they can to keep the teams employed. They love them. These are the people that serve them every day. And even though obviously a lot of them are on the management company's payroll, our board of directors have just stood up across all of the communities and just said, you know what, we want to keep our team together. So that's just a shout out to the leaders. So we've had a few situations with presumptive and confirmed coronavirus cases. And I'm just going to do a small distinction. In an HOA, where we have had the situation, number one, obviously we immediately shut down all the amenities. This was quite early in the process. Two, we had to communicate to everyone that in fact this had taken place in their community. Three, we were not permitted and shouldn't ever disclose the name of that person for privacy reasons. But one thing that did happen in an HOA is the press, of course, heard about it. And I was really disappointed, and this is kind of a coaching point for the for our boards. The press named the community, and I don't think we don't even want our community in the press as it relates to this. In this particular community, we had food deliveries and vendors that wouldn't come in because they read in the news that this community had, by the way, it was a HOA, single family homes, completely isolated in one house. I mean, there was no risk to someone coming in, but my thoughts here is, number one, you know, you shut down everything that person touches. Two, you obviously your abilities. Three, you communicate with all residents so they know what's going on. And then from a management perspective, obviously we immediately call the health authorities and we take guidance from them. And then Donna, before I let you jump in, the harder one for us is a high-rise condominium. You know, you've got Mr. Smith on the 27th floor, and he tells the management office that he's now confirmed, or she's confirmed. And by the way, I think we have 11 situations now. I can't tell you the sick person in 11 out of 11 cases have been so cooperative and so respectful of their.
That's great.
Neighbors. It's unbelievable. But we literally have had to put in protocols, and if you're in multifamily or condo environments, this is important, where if they need to go to the doctor, we literally will isolate an elevator, get them out of the building, and then follow them along with cleaning it, and vice versa. To get the food in and garbage out, we have a very specific protocol to protect everyone and our team. So we've gotten really precise, and I know all the management companies are. We're not taking a chance. But the fact that you have a resident in your community that has a confirmed case does not mean everyone else in the building's going to get it if you take the right procedures. So I can talk a bit more to that, but I want you to be able to jump in from a legal perspective. Donna, what are you seeing out there in terms of what the boards need to do to make sure they protect the community?
Well, I think, James, what you said about encouraging self-reporting is so important, because that's the most credible information we have about somebody being either exposed to the virus or having tested positive. You know, there's always rumor and innuendo, but for a person to come forward and say, hey, I've been exposed, I'm self-quarantining, or hey, I've tested positive. And now that we've got the testing sites that are opening up more and more, I'm sure we're going to learn more and more about people who are testing positive. So I think it's crucial to let people in your community know that don't allow them to be afraid to self-report. There's no stigma attached. Names will not be named. But if you let us know, we can best help you, because those people are going to need help, particularly in a multifamily building, in terms of getting to the doctor if they need to go, particularly if they're an elderly person who still needs to go to the cardiologist or another critical care provider. They're still going to need help getting their mail, and they're still going to need help with their trash disposal. You don't want them going out of their unit to take care of those things. So I think that's critical. You know, I live in a homeowners association, and you're right, in a homeowners association where you've just got green areas and you've got single family homes, the risk is much less. There's different considerations. It's unfortunate that in the example you gave, that word leaked out to the media, because that's not useful. I will tell you, in my own community, we were talking about mail carriers. Should there be some protocol? I would assume that the U.S. mail carriers at this point think everybody has COVID-19 and they're taking appropriate steps. They're not, you know, it's the same thing. That community had it. I believe every community has people who have been exposed or have been infected. So we have to, you know, there's no need for panic here. In terms of disclosure, in multifamily buildings, do you know what I call our condos, our high rises? They're like stationary cruises in some regards, James. You've got people sharing the same airways. the same passageways, and thousands of surfaces. So we've learned some lessons from what took place on these cruises. I think we're in a much better position to deal with spread of the virus in our multifamily buildings. I think that disclosing that there's an infection in the building or exposure is not only necessary, but it gives you another opportunity to reinforce the protocols you've already put in place. I can't tell you in some of my communities how the reaction from people has changed when they were grumbling about the pool and the fitness room being closed. After there was a disclosure that there was an active infection, one or more in the building, those grumbles faded away. Then they suddenly got it. It became real to them. Until they learned that, I don't know, we all sort of think that this is happening somewhere else and not in our community. But I believe notification without naming names, that's important. And I also don't like naming floors. There's no reason to name a floor. This is everywhere. But once you let people know and work with council in terms of crafting the proper notification, people then get it. That's your opportunity. Look at it, boards, as an opportunity to reinforce the steps you've taken to keep your residents safe.
I think for those communities, which are probably most of you that haven't yet had an infection, I mean, you really have to war game this. You have to assume you now have one, and what are you going to do? And one of the, we talked about a playbook. I'm sitting here in front of a document that literally walks through what if scenarios and what our recommended protocols are, and even sample communications, so that when it happens, you don't have to think, well, what am I going to communicate? Obviously, it says right across the top of this document, subject to your association's legal counsel, because these are great communications that we have found effective so far, but each community is unique. And especially, I know we have some self-managed communities on this chat, on this webinar. So there's nothing really proprietary about what we're doing. These are just best practices. I'm sure most of the management companies have the same thing. So we are welcome to share, but please don't wait until it happens and then try and come up with your response plan. It's something that has to happen now. So Donna, we have 2 minutes left. I think we have so much backed up questions here that I think we'll have to do this perhaps same time next week. That was our plan based on that. I see we've had between 300 and 400 people on here. So there's a big thirst for this information. I know we haven't answered all the questions, but I do think that the message I'd like to leave, and I'll let you close, is there is a best practice. There is a best way. They're getting better every day because we're learning more every day. But I'm so apprehensive about saying this is the way you should do it, because everyone on this call has a slightly different circumstance.
Right.
And that's where there may not have been a more important time, and I know I'm pitching for legal counsel right now, but this is protecting the board from making a bad decision. Whatever plan you put together, put it to your legal counsel and make sure that they bless it. And you even said to me, you guys are even on some uncharted waters as the legal profession, but I'll give you the last word on your guidance to our listeners about what kind of questions or what kind of interaction or how frequently with their legal counsel.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks so much for putting this together, James. It's just so important right now because there's so much confusion and the landscape is just changing on a daily basis. To our boards, I would say people are going to be looking to you for leadership. They're going to be looking to you to kind of calm their fears. The more you can communicate with them in a calm and consistent manner, the better off it's going to be. You will have grumbles. You have grumbles during everyday life. So expect it. Expect people to be short-tempered. Expect them to be unhappy about their current circumstances, that there's certain areas in the community that they still have to pay for and can't use. This is all to be expected. Know ahead of time. Get your plan ready ahead of time. You, as James said before, you will have infections. There is no reason every one of you should not be creating a COVID-19 disaster plan that you're implementing now with the help of legal counsel and certainly taking into account the way your management professionals assist you. This is a collaborative effort. We're all in it together. But I will tell you, James, I am so heartened because the conversations I'm having with clients is not about how do we avoid liability or protect ourselves. It's not that. The conversations I'm having across the board is how do we protect our community? And I think that says a lot about who we are.
That's fantastic, and thanks. That's a great close. So I think the advice we got in the beginning of this pandemic when it came to America was great personal hygiene, social distancing, and making sure all our common surfaces are clean, and they still apply. And I love what you said, Donna. They're looking to the board. I mean, they're also looking to legal counsel and management, but their board of directors are the people on this phone, on this webinar, and we're here to support you in any way we can. But the number one outcome here is make sure everyone stays healthy and to end this as quickly as possible. So from Don and I want to thank everybody for investing your time in this conversation. We look forward to your feedback when we reach out to you. We do see the list of questions coming in, and so we'll organize another one. The current plan right now is do it next week, same time, but we'll communicate directly. So have a great day. Appreciate your involvement. And
Stay safe.
stay safe. Thanks, Donna. Take care.